Welcome, everyone, to the Brass Fall 2022 Online Symposium. I am Angel Truesdale, the chair of the Business Reference and Academic Libraries Committee for Brass and the chair of the Symposia Subcommittee. I want to thank our subcommittee, Christy Cunningham, Brian Garrison, and Christine Pollock. Thank you for spending your time with Brass today and our presenters. And I would like to turn it over to Christy to get us started for our first session.
Hello, I would like to welcome you to the Fall 2022 Brass Symposium. I'd also like to say thank you to Angel Truesdale, who has been our chair and been wonderful. And her name should have been on that slide going by. I've chastised her already about that. So thank you, Angel, for leading us. And thanks to all of you who proposed sessions for today. We had difficult discussions and decisions when choosing what would be on today's schedule. But we think we have three fantastic topics, and so as not to get in their way, our first session is called Storm in a Teacup, the Climate of ESG Resources. And this is a panel discussion led by Edward Lim from the University of Connecticut. There should be some time for audience questions, maybe one or two. And Edward, I'm going to turn it over to you to get our day kicked off. So
thanks, Christy. Yeah, welcome everybody. Online presentations always make me nervous because you don't know who you're talking to, you don't know what you're talking to. So hopefully this works out. I'm not the expert here today. Today we have a couple of people on the panel to really share about ESG. And this is kind of like a fun slide that Canva helped me with it. And I wanted to keep the mood light since the end of the year. And we probably all had a tough year. So this is really what we are hoping to achieve in the next 40 minutes or so. We have a bit of buffer time, but the priority really is to talk about the experiences that we have, both the panelists as well as you in the audience. What are the kind of questions that you'll be getting from researchers, from students. Some of you, most of you have had interactions with some of the vendors who provide such ESG data. So we want to spend most of our time talking about that. And one of the things that we hope we can achieve from this short session that we have is to kind of like inspire more discussion, more sharing, in terms of, we all know something different from different parts of the world on different topics. ESG is incredibly broad, incredibly global as well, and it all kind of affects each other. And then the last thing, which is not so much of a priority, but I want to recognize that we all come into this discussion at different levels, different understanding levels. We know different things. So we will not have time to really, explain and describe and introduce ESG as a concept. But we hope to do so. And I'm going to share the slides for what Michael did. Michael is one of our panelists. And he presented about this at a conference just last month. So I'm going to share the slides in the chat so that for those of you who would like a little bit of an introduction, a background, I think his slides would be great. And feel free to ask questions. So these are our three panelists here. We have Carolyn. Carolyn is the social sciences librarian at University of Buffalo. Really glad to have her here. Because she will share more from a more social sciences perspective. We have Reece. Reece is over at Toronto Metropolitan University. So it's great that Reece comes in with sort of a US kind of perspective on how students have been asking him, including entrepreneurs. And then lastly, we have Michael. Michael is at the University of Notre. And he has incredible expertise and knowledge about all the different ESG data sources, and he has been helping researchers at the business school that he serves. So we have a great lineup of panelists today. I just want to give a shout out to Jie. Due to a scheduling conflict, she can't be here with us today for the panel. She's supporting NYU Stern. She's the business and economics data librarian over there. So we will move on, and just to share, just to get everybody kind of set up, we have 3 prepared questions. These are the 3 prepared questions that we have that the panelists will talk and discuss, and then I will be focusing on the chat just to make sure that we catch what everybody else wants to share or wants to ask questions about, and I'll try to build that in to the conversation as well. We have we have about 30 minutes or so. I'll be looking at the clock as well, so I'll be trying to manage everything. But definitely, feel free to share your comments and questions in the chat. So without further ado, we will start the first question here, which is really sort of an introduction just to get everybody oriented. What is ESG? What exactly do our users mean when they ask for ESG data? So I'm going to start off with Carolyn. Maybe you would like to kick us off.
Sure. So with ESG data, really ESG, environment, social, governance. So that's what we're really talking about. And there are, as Edward said, there are several vendors out there that are supplying ESG data right now. So we're going to I know we're going to share a little bit more about those specific vendors, but really what it's looking at is a company and ranking that company based on environmental, social, and governance factors. So it's really looking at the risk that if you're investing in this company that they might come up against. What are some, all those different factors that play into their overall ranking, and then you can kind of break it down even further into those 3 pillars, as we call them. So it's widely used by business students. I know that Reece and I both work with entrepreneurship students, and they often come to me in order to look for rankings and then overall corporate social responsibility, corporate responsibility, because that is really what ESG goes hand in hand with, is that corporate responsibility aspect. And usually it's a lot of competitor information. So when I'm dealing with entrepreneurs, they want to see what is already out there as far as their competitors, what kind of data, what kind of rankings do these people have, what kind of rankings are within the industry already. If they're going into a healthcare space that they're maybe creating a startup in, that's going to be a big thing that they might want to look at is, what are some of those industry trends as far as ESG data goes, and who are those top performers as well. And I think the other thing is to challenge entrepreneurs, especially, to go beyond just those hard numbers. We're here to talk about ESG data, but I think it's also going beyond those hard numbers and saying, okay, so everyone right now is kind of using different factors and different frameworks, right? So let's take a look at some of those reports that companies are putting out, and what kind of other certifications and activities are they doing that maybe contribute to those rankings. And I can talk a little bit about the social aspect, but I wanted to let, I think, Reece especially jump in on the entrepreneur end as well.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in now if that's okay with you, Edward. Great, yeah, and thanks, Carolyn. So I feel exactly the same in that, I think oftentimes when I have students come and ask me for ESG data, I want to back up a little bit, and I'm always eager to show them some of the different databases we have that will give them those numbers. But like Carolyn, I'm really reluctant to do that without learning a little bit more about what they're actually looking for. So while I see some entrepreneurship students, I actually see our incubator students who might not be even taking any courses and just doing that sort of incubation program. And oftentimes they're looking at how can I make my business, the most sustainable. I'm looking into social entrepreneurship, and how do I sort of aim for a certain ranking. In which case I think that ESG data, while it's interesting and I think it's a valuable tool, I think it's not always the best fit for when students are looking for when they come and ask for it. So oftentimes I'll actually point them toward things like B Corp certification, taking a look at UN sustainability goals, some of the other things that are outlined on our resources page, because ESG isn't sort of the be all end all, but it is a really trending term, I think. So students will sometimes come and ask for it. One of the things that I'm also finding that users are asking for, or some of the users that are coming to me, what they're asking for is just sort of a general understanding of social entrepreneurship. And that's actually happening a little bit more these days, I'm finding. So like when we see this question of what our users asking, it's looking at who our users actually are. And we've got a course here for non-business students on social innovation. And this is one of the main topics they're really interested in too. So I think one of the things about helping users with ESG data is being able to explain to them what it actually is, talking about the investment risk part of it and how that's really the key component of it, as opposed to if you just look at the words environmental and social governance, some students can misinterpret it as being a way of rating whether a company is sort of socially positive or not, as opposed to whether that risk is there or not. So I wanted to pass it on to Michael as well, just to not to make sure that we can keep everything going.
Yeah, on my end, I have some experience of people using ESG data kind of getting out of the business realm of things as well, because I have economics students who are using it really frequently, as well as faculty members. And they tend to like it due to just large scale data set usage. There tends to be at least a decent amount of historicity to it, but there's always the element of negotiating the question when somebody comes in to ask about ESG data, because in a lot of instances, I do have like somebody from economics wants to do a historical analysis, but they find that ESG is more current than they would want it to be. A lot of times ESG data can like track back to 2014 or so, and they're needing something that goes back decades further, which just isn't going to happen when it comes to ESG data. I also frequently get people that were coming in, they asked for ESG data, but what they're really looking for is greenhouse gas emissions. And that's something that's an element of ESG, like greenhouse gas emissions are calculated and put in this documentation under the environment category pillar score. So you can get it from there, but it's possible you might find some governmental sources that it's easier to get access to that sort of data than it would be to actually dig through an ESG scorecard to bring all that to the forefront. Probably the most interesting thing is in the past month, I've had a couple of philosophy faculty members actually asking for ESG data, and talking with them was once again well, are you really looking for the data element? And it turned out, no, they were more looking at the conceptual level of investigating ESG as it pertains to business ethics. The history surrounding it, why it came to be, whether or not it's actually pushing companies more forward to be more environmentally conscious, which kind of runs into what Reece mentioned previously of whether or not this is actually measuring the positive impact of a company as opposed to just its risk. So those are kind of some of my user group experiences.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Oh,
yeah, I was just going to jump in really quick because I had an interesting case as a social sciences librarian. We've talked a lot about economics, business, entrepreneurship, and I had a student that came from political science, and I do receive several requests outside of their typical business department, and this graduate student was looking specifically for ratings that on natural resources, and especially regarding water and water usage. And she wanted to kind of see how different companies were handling and reporting in areas of water scarcity, for example, and wanted to compare this kind of reporting and these ratings with public policy. And so, is the government really effective in doing this? Are there ways for companies to manage this on their own? So she was kind of doing this comparison, and the ratings are really helpful to her as like one aspect of her whole study that she was taking a look at. So, and we encouraged her not only to just look at the ratings, but of course, the full filings, the documents, the reports, like any other item. But, those data points were really integral to her because she had articles that also mentioned these ratings, and she was doing this literature review. So it kind of all led back to this, and this is a great starting point. And she had two specific variables in mind. And I think sometimes students will come, and if we don't have those specific data points, they get very disappointed. So that's always something to address is, we don't have MSCI, but we do have S&P Global. So let's take a look at what they have. And so there is a little bit of navigating there that you have to do sometimes with students, especially, like I said, if they come with very specific data points in mind. And again, just to bring up, you know, the UN Sustainable Goals, the policies, like a lot of that kind of feeds in and is another important part, but that's what I think we've all said that. But students really do sometimes focus on those scores, and our job as information professionals is to show the wide range that's available to them.
I'm going to pause here for a moment to see whether we have any questions or comments from the audience. I just want to draw your attention to our slides. I placed them at the back at the very end, where there, you know, I try to summarize some of the key frameworks and you know, reporting frameworks and guidance frameworks that you would kind of see, you know, when you're looking into the topic of ESG. And there's a historical, you know, perspective to this as well, but these are kind of like the core names that we can familiarize ourselves with, and it will help when we are dealing with some of our, you know, users, you know, when we are talking about, you know, UN SDGs. You know, for example, I learned that, you know, the GRESB is ESG performance specifically on real estate or real assets, as in real estate assets, if I'm not wrong. And then you can see that from the CDP and from the SAM CSA, these are questionnaires that are given out to companies. So they rely a lot on self-disclosure, right? What the companies are willing to say about how they conduct businesses. So a lot of them rely on that. But that kind of segues hopefully into our second question. I'm going to jump back here to our second question. I don't see anything in the chat. So I'm going to continue on to our second question, which is really about how do we find, you know, or locate the right ESG data for our users. I think we mentioned this, you know, some of our panelists mentioned this a little bit. Anybody? Michael, do you want to start off first, since you're the one that sort of set the stage for all the ESG data sets?
Yeah, I can do that. I would say one thing as far as locating an appropriate ESG data set is going to be the historicity of it. What years does it cover? So one, we have at my institution, we have multiple ESG data sets in our collection. So we have like Bloomberg ESG scores. We can view Sustainalytics, but not export, which that can be one element of your question is, to what degree are you able to actually export and get access to the raw data from a data set. So like if I were to have a patron come in and ask for Sustainalytics, that's one that's going to basically be off the table because A, I can't afford it, it's too cost prohibitive, and B, we only have the viewing rights. So it's like you could maybe investigate one company looking at this in a very kind of niche way, but if you're looking to do a comparison against like a whole index, it's not going to happen with Sustainalytics. MSCI is one that my institution's having issues with. We purchase it through Words. MSCI used to be called KLD Analytics and has a good bit of history to it, but they haven't been updating in Words. So their latest available data set is from 2018. And most of my business faculty members, they're looking on very current topics. So that tends to just pretty much eliminate it from the pool of things that they could use altogether. So oftentimes they're looking for the history of the data, they're looking for the comprehensiveness of the data, and price is always going to be a factor as well. So in some instances, you're just kind of having to work with what's available. I find that a lot of faculty members and students respond really well to Thomson & Reuters ESG data scores that they have right now. Thomson & Reuters kind of has, it seems, a bit more user-friendly of a platform as far as getting stuff out of it and getting the raw data so that you can work with it. So it tends to be the case that if students are investigating ESG, that's one that I would usually start them on so that they could get an introduction to like, what does ESG look like? What are the capabilities of taking the data out and working with it? And usually if I direct a student working on a new ESG project to something like Thomson Reuters, that'll kind of be their sticking point. And from there on, they'll start wanting comparison data sets. Because something about ESG scoring systems is that they're not really standard across the board. like these companies, Sustainalytics, Bloomberg, Thomson Reuters, they all have their methodologies for how they calculate ESG scoring systems. So generally, if somebody's starting to investigate ESG at a more in-depth level, they're not just wanting one set, they're wanting multiple ones that they can compare against to see if there's like any differences or outliers between them, which that's where the cost problem comes into play again, because once you start comparing across multiple sets, now you're exponentially increasing the price that this project is going to cost, the more comparisons you want, right? So yeah, that's kind of some ways to identify appropriate ESG data sets from my view and some of the factors that surround that.
Reece, Carolyn, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that Michael had said. And I think I just wanted to underline, like, I think how relevant it is to take a look at the skills and the needs of the users. I go even one step easier. A lot of like our choices for ESG data at my institution are basically some that are on WRDS, like Thomson Reuters, which a lot of students, I think, actually our students have troubles with. A lot of them haven't used that platform before and find it difficult. We're lucky to have Emergent sustainability module as one of the options. And that's the one that I find like the most accessible to users. So if there are students that are sort of just interested in exploring it and they don't have specific companies in mind necessarily, or they're a little bit more flexible as to where they're looking into, then the Emergent one is the one that I recommend because it's just a little bit more user friendly, and they may have used Emergent in some other case. That said, it's so lacking in companies, and specifically, and this is something that this is where my Canadian perspective can come in. I think I can say most of these different companies don't have a lot of international outside of the US companies that are represented, and Emergent is starting to say that they're going to add some Canadian ones, for example, but many of them have like a pretty small sort of pool of companies that they're coming from. So a lot of it depends on, yeah, I guess bit back to what Michael had said about just availability and then the skills, I think, of the students. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges for me, at least, is that if people are wanting to look at a specific company or wanting to look at Canadian companies, we really don't have a lot of options. And sometimes it is, kind of encouraging the students to do research in a variety of different sources to try and cobble together some information rather than using ESG ratings from companies. The benefit to that, though, is that sometimes they can actually find some information that's not directly company reported and actually can come from like a variety of sources, as opposed to most ESG, if you nail down to it, it's all company reported, and it's all larger companies for and public companies really for the most part.
Yeah, I definitely agree, Reece and Michael. I think one of the things I've learned too is, because we didn't actually have an ESG module or data set or anything for a while here. And I think one of the big things as the librarian to know is that I really wanted to start looking at add-ons. So if we already had S&P, could we add on to their module? Like with Emergent, could we add on a module there? And it's not necessarily cheap, but it's a much better option as far as that goes. So if you already have products that you're comfortable with, that you trust, like it's always great to explore what they have and see if there's like some deal that can be worked out or anything like that. And then just kind of highlighting that methodology piece too, is that, if you are comparing, or even if you're just using one data set, what does their methodology look like? What are they pulling from? And just knowing that, especially if you're substituting one data set for another, like if your researcher really wanted this data set, is it a good comparison? Do they have that, the right data points they're looking for as well? So just kind of throwing it in there. Sometimes my students actually just go online and they want some of the overall rankings and just the basic breakdowns, and they can kind of build their own portfolio and cobble it together themselves. So like, I'm just there to guide them through that process. So that's kind of useful too, if you're really just starting out exploring what's out there as far as ESG data. Sometimes that works enough until you can find a data set that really works.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce what Alison is asking in the chat, really finding out what whether the person who's asking the question for ESG data, what exactly do they need, and then, conducting an, in-depth reference interview and really trying to find out, sort of the basic questions that we ask when we try to look at, data questions, right? How far back do you need the data? What's the kind of scope that you're looking at? Are you looking at, raw data or kind of derived data? Are you looking at specific industries? Are you looking at specific listed companies, private companies, and things like that? I don't see anything else in the chat. We have a little bit of time, so I could either push on or we could wait. But it is strange that the chat is quiet. I was expecting lots of comments and feedback, so we can kind of move on. Yeah, Alison talks about private companies, right? Roadblocks. Michael, Reece, Carolyn, do you have anything you want to talk about when it comes to like private companies and ESG data?
I'll say something. In general, private companies, I find tend to be a wash on a lot of kind of questions, right? There are some companies that are more private company centric that are starting to get ESG scoring systems off the ground. So there's like Preqin is starting to do ESG scores. PitchBook is another vendor that is starting to do ESG scores, and as companies, they tend to focus more primarily in the private company sphere. So I'm feeling like maybe we'll end up seeing some better traction in there, as well as if you get more third-party kind of vendors, maybe something like the CDP project, something along those lines might be a good thing to check in there. I also wanted to clarify a statement that I made earlier because Reece had brought up the Thomson Reuters scores being available in words, which kind of ups the level of expertise that you would expect your patron to have in order to make use of those. My institution actually has Thomson Reuters scores available through their Refinitiv Icon platform, which is the element that I said makes it a little bit more user-friendly. And that's something that can be kind of challenging with ESG scoring systems in general, is that they can be made available through a lot of different platforms. So you'll see things like Words has a lot of direct data access available, but might require a bit more technical expertise in order to make the best use of. A lot of vendors are kind of selling this data on their own platforms though. So like S&P, they have stuff available through their Capital IQ Pro subscription, and Thomson Reuters puts it on their Icon platform. Bloomberg has it within their terminal. But then you get weird deals like Sustainalytics is available in Bloomberg for viewing, but not export unless you pay them a fee. But it's also available through Morningstar, and I think it's also becoming available in Words. So you have a question of which platform do I even want to purchase this in? What's the cost difference? What's the ease of use? How's the data access policy work? It's kind of a very, very complicated area to fall in. And I'm seeing in the chat, thank you, Cynthia, and everybody chiming in about the Preqin and Privco options that are available and whatnot.
Right. Yeah, suddenly there's stuff going on in the chat, but I'm gonna draw Julia, right? Julia asked about boldness to Canadian focus. So I'm gonna the spot on Reece and see whether there's anything high level industry trends. Maybe you want to talk about merchant, I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. So merchant is the one that I've used that does have the high level industry trends. So you can look not just by individual company, but say, overall whether banking versus, oil companies have sort of higher levels of ESG, or like where their level is via ESG. And it breaks it down to like environmental, social, and governance. And it's actually like maybe one of the most user-friendly ways to introduce students to the concept. That said, again, they're pretty limited as far as the Canadian companies they have. So there are some, but I think it's under 20. Though I know that they have said, like when we talk to them every year, we say, we want more Canadian companies, and they say that they're working to incorporate more American overall, but also more Canadian companies. But as far as anywhere else that has a Canadian focus and higher level industry trends, I haven't found anywhere, but I'm interested in case there's anybody out there that has. Put it in chat.
Yeah, I just want to highlight, I think Jane Suda made a very good point about there's a couple, probably not just one, but a couple of published articles that are critiquing some of the ESG scoring methodologies and databases, the high profile ones, especially like MSCI. I'm not sure what the rest are. But yeah, the couple of articles out there published by researchers, who they do tests and they find out that they basically don't say the same thing at all. They definitely diverge in terms of their findings. So yeah, I know we are kind of short on time. We could try to cover some of these questions that we have here. Like somebody asked about do any of the vendors sell piecemeal for a particular question? Like for example, D&B does. That's an interesting question that I haven't really thought about. I imagine this will be very specific to a research project or to maybe what an entrepreneur needs. I'm not familiar. Maybe Michael, you're more familiar with this. Maybe something like buying something piecemeal, right?
Yeah, so the answer to that question is yes, and it depends. My only real experience with this is that Bloomberg would do it, but for a very, very crazy price. They want to kind of sell that stuff more as a package, at least in their domain, it seems. But they're willing to do it if you have the money. I would assume most other vendors would probably work out roughly the same as like if you want scorings for like one particular company, but it's probably going to come at a premium that wouldn't work out very cost efficient in the long run. That's kind of my takeaway on that. But yes, it is possible.
With that, I'm going to move the conversation back. Sort of, I know we have quite a few questions about, free or open access ESG sources and things like that. But I wanted to sort of draw back to, since we are kind of concluding, like what has everybody found useful, right? I know there's a couple of things that have been sharing around on the BizLib listserv. Robbie just shared that wonderful article that sort of summarizes ESG ratings and reporting. So I just want to draw, everybody back to sort of like, feel free to share some of the resources that you have found useful in your understanding. I'm gonna let the panelists talk about what they have found useful, in helping them stay updated. Yep.
Yeah, I'll just jump in because there are a number of, there's like ESG Today, there are some like good sources out there to just keep up to date. I myself, actually, sometimes my inbox gets very cluttered, so I like to sign up for webinars periodically. And even if you're not subscribed to these databases, for example, usually you can still get in on some of those webinars, especially if they're showcase webinars that want you to buy their product. And they'll usually cover some kind of introduction or like background information or like latest updates. So those can be great places to just get a quicker and like more like I'm committed to this hour webinar kind of situation. I went to one that was S&P and it was talking about words and ESG data, and it was a deep dive webinar. So, I think S&P does webinars. PitchBook, even though we don't subscribe to their platform, they have news, and you can subscribe to their emails and get like releases, and they release, I have it right here, the 2022, for example, they had a sustainable investment survey. So they put out resources there that are still really useful, even if you don't subscribe to every single one that you want to look at. And then, how to keep track of all that. Sometimes I'll throw it into an ESG folder and then read it on a Friday afternoon or something like that. So you can subscribe to multiple things. I think a couple of the other panelists I know have their favorites, so I'll let them jump in too.
Sure, I'll jump in next. For me personally, I love listening to podcasts because I feel like that's it. I walk a lot, and so it's like an effective way to keep up to date on ESG data. I always listen to the Bloomberg's various different podcasts, and they always tend to have a pretty good focus on ESG and sort of sustainability data. So it's a good way to sort of know what's happening right now, what people are talking about regarding it, or sometimes they'll talk about some of the different problems with how ESG is measured, that sort of thing. And one actually recent one, I think it just came out earlier this week, from The Indicator by Planet Money. There's like a 2-part series on sort of ESG and sustainable investing or something similar. And I found a link to it. So I'll just put that in chat for the part 1. But that was like a really like quick and easy, like I think they're about 10 minutes each, way to just sort of like learn a little bit about it and hear what they have to say. And it's also, I think they're useful for passing on to some occasionally to students who are interested. I'll just share those 2 sources and pass it on to Michael.
Yeah, in addition to things like podcasts, finding random journal articles, things my faculty members tell me, and all those sorts of things, I also follow a lot of governmental sources, because a lot of ESG is kind of being directed through regulation at the moment, and it's drumming up a good bit of interest in it. So like White House executive orders is one where ESG has been coming up more frequently than usual. Department of Labor is another one, because ESG gets lumped into the categorization of how federal employers are using investment strategies on retirement funds. So the Department of Labor has been having some documentation on that, as well as comments on it that have been pretty interesting to follow. And there's been a lot of movement and action from state legislatures and regional governments concerning ESG as well, which you'll see a lot of the results of those get reported in the places like Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, the major business mainline publications, where you see like Florida banning somebody from the state because of ESG investment practices or stuff like that. You can generally trace that back to the actual like letters and documentation from the Florida state government or something along those lines. So those tend to be my areas that I focus on as far as keeping up to date.
Yep.
I think sorry.
Go ahead.
Chime in because the SEC, I just wanted to put that into, and the SEC does have a good page that talks about ESG risks and opportunities. So I just put that in there too.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for contributing in the chat. A couple of links, topics as well. I just want to draw back to a comment made by Janelyn before I conclude. She mentioned about ESG data in Statista. That's new to me as well. So I'm going to leave it to the panelists to see whether you are familiar with this. In Statista, there's some ESG data. Yeah.
We just got Statista, so I'm excited now to kind of dig into that a little bit more. But yeah, like I said, we actually just subscribed last week to it. So
it looks like, Carolyn, there's like just a lot of statistics, right? And there were like 15 from Canada. So Reece, you might want to look and see if that's helpful at all. But I got super excited when I saw a few companies until I clicked into them and I'm like, oh, I think they're just getting that from the company's website. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I've had Statista for a long time, Janelyn, and as far as it's concerned, Statista has everything when you get down to it, but it's all in kind of small bits and pieces. So like, you're not going to get the comprehensiveness of like an ESG scorecard probably until Statista implements that as a module, which inevitably they probably will do at some point in the near future, right? But being there, drawing stuff from a lot more open resources, it's going to aggregate things where you'd expect to find probably stuff related to like Canadian ESG if it's on a company's website or something along those lines. And it might, if your subscriptions are aligned, it might even replicate ESG data across from other platforms, depending on what platform it is.
Thanks for sharing that, Janelyn. That was interesting. I have to go look into Statista now. Yeah, we have 5 minutes left. And I just want to assure everybody that I am capturing some of the links, and this just the last kind of parting remark. Like, I've been trying to crowdsource a resource guide that sort of covers the very messy, ecosystem of ESG and now, climate solutions, whatever you call that. So feel free to make suggestions on the Google Doc. I'll try to put what we learned today into that as well. So that, you don't feel that you need to finish reading everything on the tabs that you have open. You can always come back to it on another time. And yeah, I think that's the time that we have today. I don't know whether our panelists have any parting shots or last remarks. We have time for that, so go ahead.
I'll just say it's been like really fun. I love having these kind of conversations, and it's been great hearing stuff. Like I had no idea about Statista having some ESG info, so I'm definitely going to take a look at it. Also, just to note in chat, like I'd remembered that Juliet's question about Canadian industry level stats. I put a link in there because I'd completely forgotten about this Canadian government ESG project that includes industry level stats. So that's there. But yeah, I'm happy to be here. We'll pass it on to others.
Yeah, just wanted to say thanks, because I think that this is we're still learning so much about this topic, and it's forever evolving. So having these conversations with a large group like this is fantastic. We've all learned something, and I hope you've taken some from our presentation. So just wanted to say thanks again, and let's keep that conversation going with some of these resources.
I'll say thanks also, and also just add, like, don't be intimidated if somebody asks you like an ESG question and you're working on the desk, right? ESG is like a high concept acronym term, but when you really get down to it, it breaks down into much simpler things, right? So like greenhouse gas emissions, that's part of ESG, right? You can probably find something on that in Google or Statista or whatever, if you can just break down the question of whatever the person who's asking for your ESG data. You'd be surprised at what you can probably find out there and be able to help them, even if you don't have access to like the more high dollar intense ESG rating systems in their entirety, right?
Yep, definitely. Thank you to all the panelists for such a lovely discussion. I know time is short, but yeah, I think this is kind of like a start to a conversation. We can always try to continue the conversation on the BizLib listserv on future BRESS events and things like that. So I'm gonna hand the time back to Christy so that we have some time for some music and toilet breaks. Those are important as well.
Great, thank you all. This was great information from you and your experiences, and thank you for those of you who put things in the chat. I've been clicking on them, trying to keep up with all the resources going on, thrown around out there. I'd like to remind everybody, Angel, I guess you can stop the recording, that we are recording all of these, and that we will be putting those out there for everyone for later. So in case you have to miss one of these great sessions, you can go watch it later.